Over 9 years ago, NVIDIA released the 9600 GT, a graphics card that only has half a gig of RAM and does not have a fan, as you can see from the one that I have. There was a bunch of versions that have fans. In fact, most of them did have fans, but I had the silent version, which came with 2 DVI ports, no S-Video, and no HDMI, and of course no DisplayPort because no one really had it back then. Moving on to our first game today, guys, we have Battlefield 4. The overall FPS at 1080p was about 26. Is that playable? Is it smooth? Well, nope, not exactly. But hey, when we go ahead and bump it down to the much lower and much smoother resolution of 720p, then we get a nice and sort of buttery smooth 46 FPS. And to be honest with you, it's very playable when it comes to this frame rate. It's not exactly, 60 FPS, but hey, I think it's playable, and considering this card is almost 9 years old, actually, over 9 years old by now, I believe it was released in February of 2009, I think it's pretty decent. Now, even though the card is fanless, I went ahead and overclocked it, and I got about 180 on the core and about 150 on the memory. That's pretty decent, and we did get about 50 FPS, which is a little bit smoother. It's not exactly 60, but hey, just shows you can overclock a silent card. Now, moving on to our next game, we got CSGO, the game that pretty much everyone is playing. If they're not playing Overwatch, League, or Dota, or anything else, you're probably playing this game. And at 1080p, well, it's not 60, but it is getting 45 FPS. Though an older card like this, I don't expect you to probably run 1080p unless you really like 1080p over 720p. So let's go ahead and bump it down to 720p, and over at 720p, we get a buttery, smooth FPS of 84, which, if you're on a 60Hz monitor, is about as smooth as you can get, so it's perfect. Now, if you're streaming, you're probably already playing at 720p, or in general, if you just have a 720p monitor, or just play at 720p, then hey, this card is perfectly fine for you, and any kind of esports game other than Overwatch will run perfectly well. Now, let's move on to a much more modern title, which will be Hold Fast, Nations at War, a brand new game that just came out recently. And of course, the ground textures, just like in my GTX 280 video, are not being rendered. I'm guessing that's the DirectX 10 version. I'm guessing, because it seems that every single DirectX 11 card does not have this problem, but every single DirectX 10 and 10.1 card that I've tested out does not seem to be able to render the floor, and to be honest, it's not smooth. I mean, even when we go down to 720p, it's still not smooth. We're still only getting 19 frames. Though it is highly playable because at the end of the day, it's hold fast. It's slow paced. It takes, half an hour to reload your musket, and that's about it. So if you're looking to play the game, you definitely still can when it comes to having an older card. If you have a card around the same performance level, then just know it will run decently. Just don't expect the ground to render because I don't know if it's just early access, but it just doesn't exist. Moving on to our final game today, we have ARMA 3. The average frame rate at 1080p on the lowest settings. I mean, guys, this is the lowest settings possible. I turned off shadows. I turned off everything. There is no anti-aliasing. Anti-aliasing does not exist in this universe at this point. The average frame rate was 28. That's alright. That's kind of smoothable. A lot of people probably played DayZ on 5 FPS in the old days before they got gaming PC, so I think this is fine. And if you really want a much smoother experience, you can just mess around with the settings, tweak the INI files. I mean, there's plenty of stuff that you can do. You can have your phone go off in the middle of your recording, and because you're so far into your recording, you're just going to keep going with it. And honestly, let's go ahead and bump it down right now to 720p. And what do we get? Well, we get a whopping 53 FPS. That is so playable. It's not 60, but you don't need 60. 53 is fine. If you're on a 120Hz monitor, don't have this card. But in general, if you guys have an older card around this performance level, it's still a decent card. People nowadays need the best, fanciest GPUs, but if you're willing to drop down the resolution and just, in general, lower the settings, you'll be fine with this card. It's alright, and you know what? Even at 1080p, some titles will run perfectly well. You can't play a lot of newer titles because there is no DirectX 11 or 12 support, but hey, sometimes you don't need those new games. Sometimes the classics are the best. So yeah, have a great day.